So I want to start off with just a quick glance, a quick overview of our subject today. That, of course, is Muhammad ibn Abdullah. And according to the earliest written records of his life, he was born in the year 570. A few documents will put him at 569, but most people would say 570. And he was born in the town of Mecca, which is in the western region of the Arabian Peninsula, a region of Arabia called the Hijaz. And the Hijaz is a very mountainous region. So if you were to look at a topographical map of the Arabian Peninsula, the western portion is very rocky and mountainous. But then as you move into central and eastern Arabia, it gets increasingly flat. And you have the more traditional desert that you would think of when you imagine Arabia, right? Those rolling sand dunes and things like that. But in the Hijaz, there's a lot of mountains and rocky alcoves and things like that. And that's the side that also runs along the Red Sea, separating Arabia from Egypt and what was Abyssinia, now Ethiopia and Eritrea and so forth. All right, so he's born in that town, in that region of Arabia. And there's a particular Arab tribe that rules over that town of Mecca. So the Arabs themselves are not part of any major empire or kingdom in the region at that time. In my lecture on Tuesday, we talked about the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian or Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire and basically the Christian Roman Empire, and how they were at war with each other. And I pointed out on a map that some regions of the Arabian Peninsula were vassals of the two empires, right? In particular, the map I showed you really had a lot of vassal territories for the Persians and neglected some of the territories that were vassals of the Byzantines to the northern regions of Arabia. But Mecca was in a part of the Arabian Peninsula that was part of neither empire. And so in that region of the Arabian Peninsula, there was no centralized government. There was no unified political unit. Instead, you had a variety of competing tribes, and your tribe was everything. Tribe was life. So the reason why, your hometown or your property, your goods, your business would be safe was because some enemy tribe is fearful of your tribe. So long as your tribe is big enough and strong enough and powerful enough, healthy enough to fight and defend your resources and property, well, then your stuff is good. But if you happen to have a weak tribe, or you have a tribe that was good, but then maybe was stricken with disease or was in a war and many men died, well, then you could fall victim to a rival tribe, because in the desert, resources are scarce. So people are fighting over things like water, but also livestock, slaves as well, right? Human beings as property. And so it's a little bit like the Wild West. It's a turbulent region, it's a violent region, but it's a region that has also some established norms, some expectations, some virtues. That even though these tribes are competing with each other, it can be very cruel and harsh with each other. There are still certain virtues like hospitality, that if someone is in need, someone's traveling through those harsh deserts, the idea of refusing to provide water for them is really, shall we say, inappropriate. And other virtues like being brave and fair in business dealings. So this wasn't a society that was devoid of any kind of virtuous ideals, but it was a society that I think was strained and struggling in many ways. And I think perhaps that is one of the catalysts for the emergence of this religion of Islam that will ultimately unify all those different tribal groups into a single kingdom and ultimately a single world empire. And so when we think about the origins of Islam, it's not just one man's personal religious experience, but there's a range of factors going on. What was going on in Arab tribal society at the time? What was going on in neighboring regions? What were the needs of people? And so I think we should keep that in mind too as we think about how Islam emerged in the early 7th century. So Muhammad is born into the Quraysh tribe, which rules Mecca. And within the Quraysh tribe, it's said that there were 10 main subgroups or subunits called clans. And those clans could end up fighting each other. Even though they're all the Quraysh, those clans could fight each other. But of course, if an outside tribe was a threat, well, then the clans are on the same side because they're all Quraysh to fight, the rivals from a town like Taif or something like that. So Muhammad in particular is from the Bani Hashim. He is a Hashemite. And if you've ever seen the official name of the Kingdom of Jordan, it's called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the country of Jordan in the Middle East today. And that is because the royal family of Jordan comes from this clan of the Quraysh. So they're from the Bani Hashim. They're from Muhammad's clan. The earliest accounts of Muhammad's life also tell us that he died and was buried in a town originally called Yathrib, but we know it today as Medina, which sits also in the Hijaz, but around 200 miles to the north of Mecca, and that he died of an unidentified illness of some type, that he got sick and he died at home and he was buried. And so his grave, his elaborate tomb, which is housed within a massive mosque called the Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, is still there and visited by Muslims up to the present. So Muhammad's significance is that he is, of course, the historical founder of the religion of Islam, which today is the second largest religion in the world with 1.8 billion followers stretched all around the planet. But he was also the founder of what we could describe as the Arab Muslim civilization. The Arab Muslim civilization, a kingdom and ultimately an empire which would stretch from Arabia up through Western Asia and across North Africa and into Europe. And I mentioned this in my last lecture that in less than 100 years after the death of Muhammad, this empire ruled by Muslim Arabs stretches from Spain all the way to the Indus River Valley in South Asia, which is just lightning fast growth. I mean, it's quite a remarkable episode in world history to see the emergence of this new world power on the scene. Whereas prior to that, the Arab tribes were largely insignificant. Right? They were basically in the boonies, the boonies of the region. The Byzantines and the Sasanians, that's where it was at. That's where the power and money and everything was going on. And then you have these tribal groups off in the desert in Arabia that really weren't of any significance. Well, guess what? That all changes with Muhammad and this new religion. For Muslims, Muhammad is also, beyond being the founder of this empire, he is the final prophet sent by the one God to humanity. And so he's called the seal of the prophet. Seal as in the way you would seal something up. You would close it, like you would seal a door. The door is shut. This idea that God had spoken to humanity through other prophets throughout our history, going from the dawn of creation through the centuries to different prophets, some of which we know by name and others that we don't. And then finally, that long history of divine revelation concludes with this last prophet, and that's Muhammad. So he's called the seal of the prophets, the final prophet. And the revelation that he conveys from the one God to his people is the last revelation. So what happens next? Well, we await the day of judgment, that someday, and no one knows when, the world will end and the dead will rise and the final dispensation will occur and everyone will go either to the good place or the bad place for, presumably for eternity. All right? So he's the final prophet. He's not God. He's not the object of worship. He's not the divine being. but he is nevertheless a figure that is emulated because he's seen as the perfect example of a human being who lived their life in a state of Islam. If we use this word Islam as a qualitative state of being, that you live your life in submission to the will of the one God, Muhammad is believed by Muslims to be the perfect example of that. And so they will strive to follow his example, whether you're a man or a woman, an old man or a child, you strive to follow or to at least apply and interpret Muhammad's life to apply to your circumstances and to do what's right. And so that will ultimately lead to the production of volumes of texts that contain reports about different elements of his life, which is important stuff. Why? Because people want to know how Muhammad lived his life and how he did everything, because they want to follow his example. Because his example, his sunnah, is the best way to live, right? To live a righteous life in accordance with the will of God. And we'll, of course, expand on all these concepts later on. It's also important to note that Muhammad during his life was not an ascetic, who lived a celibate life out in the wilderness, meditating under a tree or something like that. He was a man very much involved in the world. And so he was married multiple times and he had children. And so because of that, there are actually millions of people in the world today in the 21st century who claim to be biological descendants of Muhammad. Whether or not they actually are, it's difficult to say, right? Because he lived 1400 years ago. And so there was definitely, prestige that would come if you told people you were a descendant of Muhammad. And you can find lots of different rulers, kings and so on, trying to legitimize their leadership roles by claiming that they're a direct descendant of Muhammad. So there's good reason for people to fabricate those genealogies, but certainly there are other people who are actually legitimate descendants. And the royal family of Jordan is probably a good case of people who actually are, right? Because they are from the Bani Hashim. But, there are people as far away as, South Asia and Morocco and all these other places that also claim to be descendants as well. And they may well be. But again, it's very difficult to say because you don't actually have the documentation. And I don't think anyone has taken like a DNA sample from like a surviving hair of Muhammad or something like that and actually done any kinds of tests, at least not that I am aware of. So we saw a map similar to this in the lecture on Tuesday, and this map shows the two great superpowers of the time, the Byzantine Empire, which is the Christian Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, or as it's more commonly known today, Istanbul. And then we have the Sassanid Empire of Persia here, which is a Zoroastrian empire. So you have a Zoroastrian power, you have a Christian power, and then you have Arabia sort of stuck in the middle. And as I described, Arabia, at least this part, kind of the boonies, right? It's the countryside, it's often the desert, this, harsh environment that not everyone could actually travel into, right? If you're, and there's no air conditioning or anything like that. So if you are not trained and know what you're doing, you do not want to travel into the middle of the Arabian Peninsula. You need to know what you're doing. And so if you're someone who's enjoyed the Mediterranean coastal life with its abundance of food and sort of green trees and everything like that, it's probably not a good idea for you to climb on a camel and try to find your way down into Arabia. But that's where these Arab tribes live and compete with each other for prestige and prosperity. So here's a closer look at the Arabian Peninsula. The map on the right circles the Hijaz region. So this is the region where Islam first develops, where it first takes place. The Arabian Peninsula is really huge. It's a big piece of land. And although the core of it today is all what's called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that kingdom didn't exist until 1932. And in fact, the country is named Saudi Arabia after the Saud family, and they're not from the Hijaz. They're from these flatlands in the Najd region of Arabia, chiefly Riyadh, and that's why Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia. And so the Hijaz really, for most of its history, has been very different than other parts of Arabia. It was part of empires like the Ottoman Turkish Empire. There were times where there was a separate kingdom of the Hijaz, but it got conquered by the Saudis and joined into their new nation state, which, as I said, was established in 1932. So we're focused on the Hijaz, and there's Mecca there, and this says Quraysh, indicating the tribe which governs that town. And we want to try and get a sense of what that town was like when Muhammad was born. So in my last lecture, we were talking about the whole sort of surrounding region, but we didn't really talk about Mecca that much. And I wanted to save that for today. We talked about Christianity and Judaism. We talked a little bit about Christianity. I kind of ran out of time. And I would have talked about Zoroastrianism if we had more time. But we didn't really talk about Mecca. And it's very difficult to say what Mecca was like at the time of Muhammad's birth, because there are no accounts of Mecca from that time period. In fact, the earliest written records we have of Mecca date from the Islamic period. So after Muhammad's life, after Islam has been established and has spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa and the Middle East and so forth, that's where we get the first references to Mecca. And certainly, the authors of that time period wrote about Mecca, and they wrote down what stories they had heard about Mecca prior to Islam. But keep in mind, these are Muslim authors talking about what this town was like before they received the messenger of God and the true religion. Right? So Muslim authors may not give us the most accurate, unbiased view or account of what Mecca was like. So their accounts are still, fascinating to read, but in terms of kind of a disinterested, neutral, historical perspective, there's reason to stop and to, look critically at those later accounts of Mecca. So one way to try and imagine what Mecca may have been like, and we'll talk about the Muslim accounts as well, but before we do that, is to look at surviving accounts that we have of close by cities and regions. That Mecca probably wasn't that different from these other places that we do know about. And so I want to look at two in particular. We're going to look at the southern region of Arabia here, and we're going to talk about a place called Qaryat al-Faw, which is an archaeological site. But we talked a little bit about this region in class on Tuesday. This was where a Jewish kingdom took shape at the beginning of the 5th century and lasted until about 525. So you had what was probably a kingdom of Jewish converts, so Arab converts to Judaism, that's the right way to do it. It may have also included diaspora Jews who had fled the Mediterranean region in the face of Roman persecution. It's hard to say. That kingdom, though, was then in turn invaded and conquered by the Abyssinians, or what is now Ethiopia, and they were Monophysite Christians. So we know about this region of Arabia, that particular Jewish kingdom, the history of the Abyssinian Christians in the region. And then another region that we know about is up here. This is the location of the Nabateans. So the Nabateans were an Arab kingdom, and they get conquered by the Romans and absorbed into the Byzantine Empire as well. But if we look at these two regions that are on both sides of Mecca, Mecca's in the middle, we could make some reasonable assumptions about what Mecca may have looked like based on what was going on all around it. And so let's take a look at those neighboring civilizations and cities. So first, the Nabateans. The Nabateans were a northern Arab kingdom. The official language of the kingdom, like the regions to the north, Syria and Palestine, was Syrian Aramaic or Syriac. But the common people also would have spoken a dialect of Arabic. They were Arabs, but of course they were also on a kind of the frontiers with a range of other peoples and the Mediterranean coast. And they established a fascinating capital city. It's a big time tourist destination today. And you see it in movies and television shows all the time, called Petra. And so Petra is in modern day Jordan. You can see Petra there on the map. And there's an example of one of their buildings. The city itself is actually carved out of mountains and rocks, which has allowed it to survive to the 21st century. And people can go there and look at this amazing city carved out of the stone. And you can get a sense of the territorial extent of the Nabatean kingdom at its peak, that it included the Sinai Peninsula, northwestern Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and into parts of Syria as well. And this kingdom was originally a polytheistic religious community, that they worshiped many different gods and goddesses. But then as time passed and Christianity began not far away from Petra in the Galilee, and in the 4th century, the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire, and then the Roman Empire absorbs the Nabateans, and with that they become Christians. But prior to that, they practiced this older polytheistic religion that also combined and interacted with the pre-Christian Greco-Roman religion as well. And so by looking at their pre-Christian polytheistic religion, we may be able to learn some things about religion in Mecca prior to Islam. What did the religion in Mecca look like prior to Islam? Because the Nabateans provide us with this sort of very explicit case study for Arabs who are interacting with the broader Greco-Roman world at this time. So here are some surviving artifacts from the Nabateans, and this comes from the later period where there's increasing Greco-Roman or Hellenic influence on them, but these are depictions of different deities that were worshipped prior to the Christianization of the region. And based on surviving accounts of Nabatean gods, we can actually identify many of them with later Muslim accounts and references to gods that were worshipped in Mecca. So there is some question about the extent to which this type of culture extended southward into the Arabian Peninsula, right? The Nabateans are up north. Right? They're not far from Jerusalem. They're part of the Roman Empire, but did their beliefs and practices really extend that far into the harsh environments of the Arabian Peninsula? Well, based on the archaeological excavations at Qaryat al-Fal, which is actually southeast of Mecca, further south, further into the Arabian Peninsula than Mecca, the answer is yes, it did. Yes, it certainly did reach them, probably through the trade routes, if not entire population migrations into that part of Arabia. So Qaryat al-Fal was a trading city, a city of merchants from the 1st century BCE until it fell into decline in the 4th century of the Common Era. And here are some of the artifacts that archaeologists have uncovered. This one is a bronze statue of a Greco-Roman god. This happens to be a composite deity. So this is something that happened in the Greco-Roman religions quite a lot, is that separate deities get merged together and sort of their attributes and specialties also become combined. So it's like they're even more powerful that way. But this is a composite deity of Heracles and Dionysus, right? Dionysus, super popular deity. And then Heracles, that's Hercules as well, son of Zeus. So we find this statue of Heracles Dionysus southeast of Mecca. Pretty good evidence that the pre-Christian religious beliefs of the Mediterranean world spread into Arabia. There's also items like this one. This is a statue, it's another composite deity of Harpocrates and Horus. So this is a composite deity of a Greek deity and an Egyptian deity, right? So Egypt is up to the the northwest as well. In addition to that, we have incense burners like this one. We have ruins of temples. We have altars that were used. And all of this evidence attests to the influence of the Mediterranean world, its religious beliefs, its culture, its goods extending well into the Arabian Peninsula. That the harsh deserts of Arabia do not seem to have been a barrier that prevented that influence from reaching a place like Mecca, for example. Here's the actual site itself. So these are the ruins of Qaryat al-Falq, southeast of Mecca. You can see it's not much to look at these days. It's not as pretty as a place like Petra or the ruins of ancient Egypt, but it is fascinating to think about the fact that there were once people living out here. Just look at the surrounding region. Look how desolate and isolated it is. Reminds me of, rural Arizona or a place like that. Just, gosh, no air conditioning. I mean, it must have just been very difficult to live out there. So with those observations in mind, let's look back at what later Muslim Arab writers tell us about Mecca. So according to the earliest accounts of what life was like in Mecca prior to Islam, Mecca was a polytheistic cult center where it said some 360 different deities were worshipped. And not all 360 deities are actually identified by name in the earliest accounts, but some of the deities are, the deities that were particularly prominent, those that were really the focus of worship. And what we find is that the deities that are named in these early Muslim sources, these accounts of Mecca, are generally Nabatean gods. They're generally the deities that were worshipped in Nabatea. I don't know. I'm sorry, there's a question on the screen. Is Petra overrated? I don't know. I think it's pretty awesome. I mean, all of these places get a little swamped with tourists and people trying to sell you stuff. That can kind of take the mystique away from these places, like the pyramids in Egypt, for example, but I still think it's a pretty fascinating place. So we can find that these gods are actually Nabatean deities, and they include deities like Hubal. Hubal is a major god in Mecca, and he is principally associated with divination. So if you don't know what divination means trying to get an answer or guidance through supernatural means. So like a common 21st century American example of divination would be like going to a palm reader or tarot cards, things like that. So Hubal seems to have been associated with divination, and you would go to Hubal, and the priest of Hubal would cast like arrows. And based on which arrows were tossed, some of them had like words inscribed on them and how they fell or the arrangement, those were interpreted in order to get an answer. And the belief was that it was the deity Hubal communicating an answer to the devotee. So Hubal was worshipped in Mecca, according to the earliest sources. Manat, a goddess associated with fate, and also seems to have been the partner of Hubal, the wife or the consort of Hubal. That's very common in polytheistic religions as well, that male and female deities are often paired up. You can think about in Hinduism, for example, many of the gods and goddesses are paired up, and that's certainly true of the Greek and the Roman pantheons of gods as well. Then we have the goddess El-Uzza, and she was associated with fertility. And it's thought by scholars that El-Uzza, she may not have originated as this, but by the time we get to the period when Muhammad is alive and living in Mecca, that El-Uzza was probably understood to be the Arab equivalent of Aphrodite and Venus. Right? Just like we saw at Qaryat al-Falq, these different kind of composite deities, these associations, that El-Uzza, instead of being a separate deity, was understood to just be like the Arab version of Aphrodite, the Arab version of Venus. And they were all one and the same. The next goddess, Allat, whose name literally means the goddess, was associated with war and death. And it's thought that she may have been an Arab equivalent of the Greek goddess Athena as well. Then we have Dushara, and Dushara is associated with mountains in the sky. And you could understand why it's those two things, because in the pre-modern world, before we could build skyscrapers and before we could fly in planes or anything like that, the tallest structures on the earth were mountains. And so if you thought of the sky as the realm of the gods, then you want to get the closest you can get to the gods is by going up a mountain. And so Dushara is associated with both the sky and mountain, and there's some evidence that he may have been the son of the goddess Manat as well. But the whole idea, the association between mountains and divinity, continues on in many religious traditions. So we talked about the great prophet Moses in my lecture on Tuesday. And where did Moses go to get the tablets of the law? Where did he get the Torah from? He went up to meet with Yahweh on Mount Sinai. He went up the mountain to meet with God. And it just so happens that once we get to Muhammad, and we're getting there, that in the month of Ramadan in the year 610, when Muhammad gets the first revelation of the Quran, Surah Al-Alaq, Surah 96, at least the first 5 verses of it, he's up a mountain, Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light, Mount Hira. So again, the mountains associated with divinity. It's something that we see in many different religious traditions. So in addition to lots of gods and goddesses, some really prominent and important, others sort of minor and maybe just associated with particular clans or even particular families, we also have belief in a multitude of spirits that inhabit the natural world. And these are called jinn. So jinn are sentient beings, but that don't have physical bodies, right? They're spirits. And so they can be either good or bad. They can be helpful or they can be malevolent. They can take a liking, even fall in love with human beings, but they can also attack and even possess human beings. And the Arabic word majnun, which in modern Arabic means crazy. So you say, huwa majnun, he's crazy. Majnun, the root of it is actually jinn, and it means that someone is possessed by a jinn. And so that's like the old meaning of it, that if someone is crazy, right, before we had an understanding of mental illness and other medical disorders, a common explanation for someone who was mentally ill was they must be afflicted and possessed by a jinn. And so that's the origin of the word majnun. There was also a belief that if someone was really exceptional at something, let's say you're an exceptional poet, and poetry was one of the most important and beloved art forms among the Arab tribes. If someone was an exceptional poet, you had this remarkable creative ability. People believed that the reason why a particular person could compose just such amazing, beautiful poetry while everyone else couldn't was that it must be coming from a jinn. And in fact, that's connected to the English word genius. This whole idea that your genius, your remarkable creative abilities must be from some other worldly source, like a spirit, right? Because it's not ordinary, right? If it was ordinary, everyone could do it. So what is it that it makes that person unique? It must be a jinn. That's what makes them a genius. Okay, so hold on to that idea, because when Muhammad begins his religious mission, some of his opponents are saying things like he's possessed by a jinn, right? Or he's getting this stuff from a jinn. That's where he's getting it from, not from this all-powerful God. And the jinn were particularly important to the Bedouin. So at this time, we have towns like Mecca and Taif and Yathrib, and the Arabs there have settled. But the traditional way of life of the Arabs was to live in the deserts, to be nomadic with their herds and setting up camps, and living off in the wilderness and moving from place to place. But some Arabs had moved to being basically urbanized, right? They were settling in cities. And there were some tensions at the time about the loss of traditional Arab cultures and ways of life, to the point in which it was common practice for settled Arabs like the Quraysh in Mecca to send their kids off with Bedouins so that they would learn the traditional way of life. And that happened to Muhammad. Muhammad is sent off with the Bedouins to learn the traditional way of life, like tending livestock and things like that, so that they wouldn't completely lose touch with the traditional way of life of the Arabs. There's definitely some tensions there. And so among the Bedouin, belief in the jinn who inhabited the natural landscape would have been more prominent. But among the towns and the cities of the Arabs, these deities like Hubal, which have physical shrines set in place with statues, would have had a greater prominence. So there is a little bit of a difference there between the two. And some historians have noted how those tensions may have also contributed to the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Now we have to talk about another important deity. And this deity is called in Arabic Allah. So the literal meaning of the word Allah in Arabic is the God. Or if capital letters existed in Arabic, which they don't, it would be capital G-O-D instead of lowercase G-O-D. Now, we know from Muslim sources that belief in Allah existed in Mecca prior to Muhammad's religious mission. We know this from the fact that Muhammad's biological father, his name was Abdullah, which means the servant of Allah or the slave of Allah. Abd means servant or slave, and Allah, Abdullah or Abdullah. So obviously, if people have names like that, there is belief in some deity called Allah at that time. We also know, based on the earliest Muslim sources, that important goddesses like Manat and Al-Uzza were considered to be the daughters of Allah. That the three most important goddesses in Mecca were considered to be the daughters of Allah. In fact, the Quran even makes reference to this belief among the Arabs of Mecca. So there is a belief in this sort of chief god. And the word itself, grammatically, Allah, is what we would call a contraction. Sort of like saying, if you say the two words cannot, you could say a contraction is to say can't, right? Where two words merge together. So Allah is the merger of the two words el, which is the definite article, it means the in Arabic, and ilah. Ilah means deity or God, lowercase g. So el ilah, the God or the deity, becomes Allah. And here you can see it written in Arabic. This is called the shadda, which tells you to drag that consonant. Allah, you drag that L. Okay, so it means the God, and it's a masculine term. There's no gender neutral words in Arabic. Everything is either masculine or feminine, which makes it frustrating to learn. There are other languages like that as well. But, you know, if you want to say it is, you're saying huwa, you're saying he is, or hiya, she is. There is no gender neutral term. So Allah is a masculine term. This word also seems to be a cognate with the word for God in other Semitic languages. So Arabic is a Semitic language. It's part of the same language family as Hebrew, which is the language of the Torah, as well as the Aramaic. And Aramaic was the common language. It originates in Syria, but it's the dominant language in, for example, the Galilee when Jesus of Nazareth is alive. So the common spoken language of Jesus would have been Aramaic. And when we look at those languages, we find that the word for God in Hebrew, we've mentioned this in my last lecture, we have the word Eloah, which is a singular. In the Bible, it's more commonly written in the plural, Elohim. And then we have in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, the word for God is Allah. Allah. So the Arabic Allah, the Aramaic Allah, the Hebrew Eloah are all related to each other. They're variants with the same root. And the root is probably the ancient Canaanite word El. And I mentioned the use of the word El in different Hebrew terms, like the word Israel or Gabriel, Ishmael, right? The El means God as well. So there was clearly some understanding of Allah in not only Arabia, but the surrounding region as well. The pagans considered him, it seems to be some kind of distant creator god, like the starting point, who creates the next rank of deities, like the daughters of Allah, Al-Uzza, Manat, Allah. And then they create the next rank and so on. And you have a kind of divine hierarchy. And once that supreme creator god does that initial work, sort of retires and fades to the background. And worship is instead devoted to these other ranks of deity who govern over different aspects of life, like fate, war, love, and fertility, that you devote your worship to those particular gods, and that initial creator deity kind of fades to the background. That's something that we can see in a lot of different indigenous religions. So in my world religions class, I was just teaching about the Fung people of West Africa, and they have this creator deity, it's a she, called Nanobuluku, and she creates two deities, Mawu and Lisa, and they start this hierarchy, creating more and more deities, but no one worships Nanobuluku. They worship these later deities, these later ranks. And so that could be the type of pantheon that existed among the pre-Islamic Arabs as well. That said, we know, particularly from the lecture on Tuesday, that if you went to southern Arabia, there was a Jewish kingdom there. And that kingdom later became a Christian once the Abyssinians conquered them. And they spoke Arabic there, and they used the word Allah to refer to their God as well. And so if there wasn't already a connection between this word Allah and the biblical Yahweh, it certainly existed by the time there was a Jewish kingdom in what is now Yemen and southwestern Arabia. So the Jewish tribes, and Muhammad would encounter Jewish tribes in Yathrib or Medina during his lifetime, they used the word Allah to refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as well. So this term becomes a kind of general term for this supreme creator God. And once Muhammad begins his religious mission, of course, the very foundation of his teachings is La ilaha illallah. There's no deity but Allah, right? He tells the people in Mecca that those 360 gods, none of them exist. They're false gods. And there's only one God, and it's Allah. It's the supreme creator God. And so you need to abandon the worship of any other these other gods like Hubal and Manat and so forth, Dushara, and worship only Allah. Okay? So Muslims believe that Muhammad received divine revelations from Allah, this supreme creator God. And those revelations were initially transmitted orally. Muhammad is described in the Muslim sources as having been illiterate. And that's not something that would have been unique to Muhammad. That would be the norm. Most people would have been illiterate. The whole idea of everyone being able to read and write, that's very much modern, right? When you have public education systems, that's totally modern, where everyone still learns to read and write. And of course, there are still illiterate people in America today who are able to slip through the cracks of our public education system and actually are functionally illiterate. But in other parts of the world, illiteracy is common, and certainly in the pre-modern world, in ancient times, illiteracy was the norm. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the Muslim accounts describe Muhammad as having been illiterate. So when he is receiving these divine communications from Allah and communicating them, he's not writing them down. He's reciting them aloud. And in fact, the name of this collection of revelations, Quran, literally means recitation. El-Quran means the recitation. That these are the words Muhammad is reciting to his people. Very beautiful recitations, by the way. And people are hearing them, and they're memorizing them, and they're reciting them as well. And we'll learn about how it moves from being an oral text to a written text, a written text that is translated into English like this. So these revelations that become the written Quran are at the heart of the religion of Islam. But it might surprise you to know that the Quran isn't the story of Muhammad's life. Because we, at least in this country, tend to be most familiar with the contents of the Bible. When we think about the life of Moses, we read the Torah. We can read from Moses' birth to his death. That whole story is told within the pages of the Torah, the first 5 books of what the Christians call the Old Testament. Likewise, if you want to read the story of Jesus, you've got not one, but 4 of them. There's 4 Gospels in the Christian New Testament. So the idea that the sacred book would tell the story of, the founding figure or an important figure's life is kind of an assumption that we make. But the story of Muhammad is not in the Quran. The Quran is not the story of Muhammad's life. You may have noticed that if you bought your copy for this class and just kind of flipped through, you might have noticed that it's not in a traditional narrative structure. It's something else entirely. And it can be a bit disorienting if you're not prepared and you don't have an understanding of what you're getting into when you begin to explore the text. But we'll go through all of that later on. But it's important for us in this class because, of course, the Quran, which is basically the first Muslim book. In fact, it's the first book written in Arabic, by the way. The Quran doesn't tell us this story of Muhammad. Instead, what we rely on is oral tradition that gets put into writing many years after the death of Muhammad in 632. And if we were to actually identify references to the life of Muhammad in the Quran, you actually need to already know his life story. So there is some material related to Muhammad's life scattered throughout the different surahs or chapters of the Quran, but you probably wouldn't recognize them unless you already knew the story of Muhammad. So as a kind of starting point to learn about Muhammad's life, the Quran isn't where you'd want to go. You want to look at some other material. With the passage of time, Muslim authors are going to produce texts like this one. That's a big book. This is a heavy, heavy, substantial book. This is the Sirat Rasulullah of Ibn Ishaq, in English translation. He wrote this book in the 8th century. Muhammad dies in 632, and this was written in the 8th century, so in the 700s. And in fact, the copy that I have here, this translation, is based not on an original copy of Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, but on redactions by his students, which come to us perhaps early 8th century. And these are the earliest biographies that we have. In biography, I mean like a full account of his life. And this is written from a religious perspective, so it's not a biography in the sense of a modern historical biography. It's more of a hagiography. A hagiography is an account of the life of a saint. So hagiography would have miracles and things. So that's what this has. Right? It's telling the story of the messenger of God and his divine mission to the Arabs. So this is a really interesting work, right? We have tons of details about the life of Muhammad in a book like this. This is a substantial book. We have tons of details about his life. But those detailed accounts don't exist until we get to the 8th and the 9th centuries and onward. So because of that, modern critical historians look at these materials and they go, well, these aren't eyewitness accounts. And so they relied instead on oral tradition being passed on by people who may have had different motivations and different ideas under various influences. And then all of that stuff gets coalesced into a written tradition much later. So modern critical historians will look at texts like this and they're not just going to accept all of it, right? They're going to say, really, and I'm not just talking about whether or not you believe in the miracles and things like that, right? Even basic information. There have been a small number, some radical sort of revisionists, and I am not a part of this group, radical revisionists who even, argue that Muhammad didn't exist, right? That's a really radical position, and it's one that I don't find that argument convincing at all. But that's the reason why they're going that far is because of the reality that the written records come to us long after he's said to have lived. So what types of material are found in the Quran? Because the Quran actually is put into writing. The earliest surviving fragments we have are from the 7th century. The Birmingham manuscript, which has 2 pages, just 2, it's not a full Quran, has been radiocarbon dated. This happened in 2015, and it likely dates from the 640s. So if Muhammad dies in 632, we're talking about a Quran that was put into writing, albeit an early form of Arabic writing, at a time in which people who knew Muhammad were still alive. A decade, 2 decades, 3 decades after his death. So the Quran is definitely the earliest written Muslim work. It long predates this stuff. these long biographies. But again, this isn't the story of Muhammad. There are, however, some verses admittedly that you may not recognize unless you know his story. But here's some examples of details and events related to Muhammad's life that actually are found in the pages of the Quran. So the first verse I have here is from the 17th surah of the Quran, and it says, exalted is, and I know this might be, the phrasing of the verses might be a little disorienting because we haven't learned how to read the Quran yet, which is going to come later, but bear with me. Exalted is he who took his servant, the servant here is Muhammad, by night from al-Masjid al-Haram to al-Masjid al-Aqsa, this is Mecca to Jerusalem. That's what these terms are understood to mean. Whose surroundings we have blessed to show him our signs. So this verse probably dates from around the year 621, and it's a reference to the belief that Muhammad miraculously journeyed from Mecca to the holy city of Jerusalem, basically at the speed of light alongside the angel Gabriel. So we have that reference there in the Quran, but of course, it's not easy to recognize that unless you already know the story. Next, we have a reference to a battle that Muhammad participated in the year 624. It says, Allah helped you at Badr. The battle is called the Battle of Badr and it occurred in 624 when you were weak and a small force. And so that verse comes to us from after Badr, so maybe around 625. We have an actual reference to Muhammad by name here, and there's a surah named after him as well. It says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah has full knowledge of all things. So there we have a nice, solid detail about Muhammad's life in the Quran. It says that he's not the father of any of your men. So this says that he didn't have any sons. And that aligns with the later biographical accounts that say that actually he did father 3 sons, but they all died as infants or very small children, so they didn't survive. So he's not the father of any of your men. And so that aligns with it. And then the last example I've provided here, it is he who withheld their hands from you and your hands from them within Mecca after he caused you to overcome them. So this, again, you wouldn't know it, but unless you already know the story, but this is a reference to the conquest of Mecca. So this would have been from around the year 630. So that's the type of biographical material we have in the Quran for Muhammad. But as you can see, it's very difficult to construct a life of Muhammad based solely on the Quran. We need to turn to other material like this, which even though critical historians will challenge the content of this material because it was oral tradition for so long, nevertheless, the story, regardless as to its historicity, regardless as to whether or not we can verify it, is the story that Muslims know. It's the story that Muslims reference in understanding their religion, understanding the Quran, understanding how to practice their religion. So while I will point out some historical issues at various points in our study of Muhammad, we're also going to learn the core story because it's that story which has a kind of life and significance unto itself, all right? So here's some of the earliest Muslim accounts of Muhammad's life. So we have this one that I'm holding here. This is Ibn Ishaq there. And as I said, Ibn Ishaq's original was lost to us. So what we have are the elements that were preserved by his students like Ibn Hisham and others. And you can see the dates for these authors and their texts. So we're talking about, Ibn Hisham, this is 9th century, Al-Tabari, that's 10th century, Al-Yaqubi, that's the late 9th century. And we also have another genre of text which takes shape, which we'll collectively refer to as the hadith. The word hadith in Arabic means report, a narration. And Muslims developed the tradition of passing along individual hadiths, individual reports or stories about something that Muhammad said or did, or that his early followers said or did as well. And in time, those oral traditions get written down as well, except they're not used to create a biography, a single narrative. They stay in the form of those little stories or those sayings, and then they get categorized according to the topic. All right, so you might have a book that has hadiths about prayer, And then there's all these just little sayings and stories about how to pray correctly. So that's another genre of literature, but you can piece together elements of his biography from that material as well. So one of the earliest written works of hadith is the Muwatta of Imam Malik, who lived in Medina and spoke to the elders of the city of Medina when he compiled his text in the 8th century. And then we have far more influential works of hadith. And the reason why they're more influential is because of the methodology that the scholars used when they were compiling them. And those are the works of hadith from the 9th and 10th centuries, such as Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. These are considered to be the most authoritative, most influential collections of hadiths. And it's from these hadiths that we get the sunnah, the example of Muhammad that Muslims can strive to follow. But again, it's not biography, right? It's not a biographical account of his life. It's just these individual sayings and stories. So using that literature, those biographies, hadiths, we piece together the life of Muhammad. And the earliest accounts of his life tell us that he was born in a year known as the Year of the Elephant. And this is, the name derives from this legend about a Abyssinian governor, right? Because the Abyssinians had conquered the Jewish kingdom here, which was the kingdom of Himyar. And it said that the new Abyssinian governor, who was a Christian, wanted to build a great cathedral that would be a pilgrimage destination for all the peoples of the immediate region. But the governor got jealous of the town of Mecca, that people still insisted on making pilgrimage to Mecca to visit this shrine there called the Kaaba instead of visiting his cathedral. And so the story goes that he decided then that he was going to destroy Mecca. He was going to destroy the Kaaba so that the pilgrims had to come to his capital and come to his great cathedral on their pilgrimage routes instead of going there. And so he put together an army, and in his army, he had African elephants. So he had war elephants, at least one. And he set off with his army towards Mecca. And when they approached the outer regions of the city, it said that his mighty war elephant stopped and then knelt down in front of the city as if in prostration. And meanwhile, these birds took off from the surrounding mountains with rocks and dried clay in their claws and pelted the army. And the army retreated in terror. And it's because of that event that it's called the Year of the Elephant, or the year 570 of the Common Era. So the belief is that this was an example of Allah, the supreme creator God, protecting Mecca, protecting this sacred shrine from invasion from this hostile governor. And that also happens to be the year that Muhammad was born in Mecca. So for Muslims, Mecca is a very special place. You've probably heard about the pilgrimage to Mecca. Maybe you've seen movies about it. Maybe you've watched Spike Lee's film about Malcolm X, where Malcolm X famously goes on his pilgrimage to Mecca. Maybe you read the autobiography of Malcolm X and you read about Malcolm's pilgrimage experience in his own words. Well, for Muslims, Mecca has a history that goes back long before Muhammad, long before the Year of the Elephant. Muslims believe that this city was actually founded by Ishmael, the first son of Abraham. And we learned about Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac in my discussion of Judaism on Tuesday. So the belief is that when Abraham cast Hagar, that's Ishmael's mother, and Ishmael out into the wilderness, that they settled in what would become Mecca, and that the water that had miraculously gushed forth in order to help them survive the harsh environment would become the well or the spring of Zamzam, which is still the sacred water of Mecca today. And when pilgrims go to Mecca, they traditionally drink that water. So over time, it's said that Abraham still went to visit his son Ishmael. This isn't in the Bible. This is a purely Muslim tradition. And that Abraham, on one occasion, built this shrine devoted to his God in Mecca. And that shrine becomes what we know today as the Kaaba, this large 50-foot high cubicle structure. And in fact, while today it's a big cube, historically at one point, it actually had a curved wall. And there's still a short wall indicating where that part of the Kaaba existed, but it's not there anymore. So today it looks like a big 50-foot cube. And the walls have been rebuilt many times. But the belief is that the foundations go back to the time of Abraham and Ishmael, and that Ishmael is even buried beside the Kaaba along with his mother Hagar. And that Ishmael, living amongst the other peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, becomes in turn the patriarch of the Arabs, and the Arabs are Ishmaelites. And so the special divine favor that Abraham had received, which for Jews and Christians passed only to Isaac, and by extension then to Jacob, for Muslims, Abraham's special relationship with God extended not just to Isaac and Jacob, but also to Ishmael. And thus it would be from the line of Ishmael that Muhammad would come and that Muhammad is born. So here are a couple of verses from the Quran that reference this belief in Abraham and Ishmael and the establishment of Mecca. In the second surah or chapter of the Quran, it says, "And when Abraham and Ishmael were raising the foundations of the house," that's the Kaaba, that shrine, "Abraham prayed, 'Our Lord, accept from us this duty. Lo, thou and only thou art the hearer, the knower.'" And here's another passage. This is from the 14th surah of the Quran. "Abraham said, 'O Lord, I have made some of my offspring to dwell in a valley without cultivation.'" This is the valley where Mecca is. "By thy sacred house," that's the Kaaba shrine, "in order, O our Lord, that they may establish regular prayer. Praise be to Allah, who has granted unto me in old age Ishmael and Isaac," right? Both sons, not just Isaac, not just Ishmael, but both sons. "For truly my Lord is he, the hearer of prayer." And if you look at this image here, this is the Maqam Ibrahim. This is a shrine to Abraham in Mecca that stands beside the Kaaba. And if you go in and you look inside of it, there's footprints. And the belief is that those are the footprints of Abraham, because that's where Abraham had once stood to worship Allah. So we actually have an actual shrine to Abraham right next to the Kaaba in Mecca, right? It's not a shrine to Muhammad, it's a shrine to Abraham. This is what the Kaaba shrine in Mecca looks like today. So here you can see it's a large cube-like structure. And if you look at the little white dots along the bottom, those are pilgrims. These are people. It's crowded here. It doesn't look like that now, thanks to COVID. People aren't allowed to crowd into Mecca any longer because of the pandemic. But this is during Hajj, and there's that shrine to Abraham. That's what that is. And you can see that it's built with bricks. These bricks that we see today come from the 17th century. The Ottoman Turks rebuilt the Kaaba structure once again. So these are 17th century bricks, but the foundation is older. Here's a door to the interior of the Kaaba. And then this is called the Kiswa. This is a cloth covering that is, the Saudis today replace it every year. But other rulers may have changed it at different intervals of time. And this is actually, this Arabic calligraphy is actually gold. It's cost a lot of money for the Saudis to do that, but they have that money thanks to the oil industry. There's nothing inside the Kaaba except some lamps and some pillars, and this is a diagram of the interior of the Kaaba. But when Muhammad was born, and for the first 40 years of his life, well, longer than that actually, but the Kaaba was filled with idols, statues to gods like Hubal and Manat and El-Uzza, all these different deities, that this would have been the focal point of the worship of those 360 different deities in pre-Islamic Mecca. And so what's ultimately going to happen is that as Muhammad's religious mission takes off and his following grows, that in the year 630, he and his followers conquer Mecca. He spares everyone who lives in the city, but he goes in and he destroys the idols. He smashes the idols, not unlike Moses destroying the golden calf, or Jesus attacking the money changers in the temple in Jerusalem. Muhammad goes and he destroys the idols, and the Kaaba is cleansed. It becomes an empty shrine devoted only to Allah, the one ineffable God who is not depicted with any statues or anything like that. And so it is restored to the purpose of it when Abraham and Ishmael were alive, right? That Abraham and Ishmael had built this originally as a place to worship the one God. And then over the hundreds of years, people had corrupted it and installed their idols and all their other gods. But now the seal of the prophets has come, and he comes and he destroys those idols and restores it, purifies it to the worship of the one God, to the worship of Allah. So now I want to share with you, well, I've only got 4 minutes left. Well, let's go ahead and just try this out. This is a clip from that documentary I mentioned. Let's see if it mutes the audio for copyright violation. Let's go ahead and test it out. So if it goes mute, then tell me in the live chat.
At the age of 5, Muhammad returned to his mother Amina and lived in Mecca, but she was in poor health. She decided to visit some of her family in Yathrib, a town about 300 kilometers north of Mecca. But as the camel caravan made its way through the desert, Amina's illness got worse. The caravan stopped here in the small oasis of Abwa in order to drop off Muhammad and his mother in the hope that she would recover her strength. But it was not to be. After just a few days, Amina died. With both his parents now dead, Muhammad was all alone in the world, an orphan at the tender age of 6. These searing events would have a profound impact on his outlook and his personality.
Muhammad's virtually alone at this resting place, watching his mother die. And it's only when the next caravan comes on this well-established journey that he gets reintegrated in society. It must have been terrifying and deeply poignant and disturbing.
The young Muhammad was to learn even more about loss and sorrow. He was taken in by his paternal grandfather, who died just 2 years later, before coming under the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, a powerful figure among the Meccan elite. Abu Talib was a trader taking caravans to Syria, part of a business which from ancient times connected Arabia to the populous centers and civilizations of the Middle East and beyond. Mecca was a link in that chain.
I imagine trading caravans, picking up the spices from the Yemen, the silver, or the leather, bringing them to Mecca, and a quite separate group of traders picking them up and taking them to Syria, to Gaza, to Egypt, to Palestine. And all around the Holy Sanctuary, they've had the bustle of trading and the camels being gathered.
For Muslims, Mecca is seen as a major trading center at the time and a fitting place for the birth of their prophet. But some historians dispute its historical importance.
The Muslim tradition gives us a portrait of Mecca as this great trading city, this great pagan cult center. And the problem is that the archaeology and the records at the time do not back this up. Mecca, if it existed, was way off any trading routes, and we have no mention of it at all before the Islamic era.
This is easily explained by the fact that Mecca was in the middle of the desert, and we know that these foreigners, historians, would not cross such a hostile terrain as the Arabian deserts to get to Mecca. They kept to the sea or to the coast. And if they haven't talked about it, this is understandable. I mean, people here didn't talk about Timbuktu in the 18th century or before. It didn't mean that it didn't exist.
The charge by some historians is that at the age of...
So I assume that the audio worked okay there. I cut it off just because we're out of time today, but we'll pick up there talking about Muhammad's youth when he was an orphan, and as he gets older and starts work on the trade caravans, and then ultimately gets married. So that'll be our starting point for class next Tuesday. Please remember to do the map assignment, right? That is due by the start of class on Tuesday, and to finish the reading on the life of Muhammad as well. Let's see, so this question, which part of the slide will we need to study for the map quiz? The map quiz is just geographical location. So you won't have to reference any of my slides to do it. You can use Google Maps, right? You're just going to find where's Mecca, where's Medina, where's Jerusalem. So feel free to use any world maps to answer those questions on the quiz. All right. So if you have any other questions or concerns, feel free to email me. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and I will see you back here on Tuesday. Bye.